Have you ever paused to consider how the objects you hold in your hand or bring into your home might carry a darkness far greater than their mere physical form? What if some things you think harmless could be gateways, portals, inviting forces beyond your control? Today, I invite you to walk carefully through this shadowed path, to uncover 6 objects that, once embraced, bring curses, not just metaphorical, but spiritual afflictions that cling to the soul. The question is, are you willing to risk your spiritual well-being for the allure of curiosity or fascination? The world teems with objects imbued with power, not the power of creation or goodness, but the power of destruction, deception, and despair. These objects carry a heavy cost, a price paid in anguish and spiritual bondage. It is no exaggeration to say that to possess them is to invite a darkness that can corrupt your very soul. The sirens of the spirit world, many have dismissed this board game as mere childish amusement. But beneath its veneer lies a sinister truth. It is a tool that attempts to communicate with spirits beyond the veil, spirits that are not bound by the love and light of God, but by cunning and malice. To use such a board is to open your heart's door to forces eager to deceive and destroy. The Bible warns against seeking knowledge from the dead, for such knowledge is a snare and leads only to ruin. Cursed jewelry and amulets jewelry may seem innocent, an adornment of beauty, but beware those said to carry curses or demonic blessings. Objects like these, often tied to occult practices, carry spiritual venom. When worn, they become chains binding the wearer to dark intentions and unseen tormentors. The Apostle Paul reminds us that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. These cursed talismans are the armor of those dark forces. Demonic statues and idols across cultures, statues have been crafted to honor the divine. But what if the divine they honor is a false god? Idols, in their essence, are affronts to the one true God. To invite such figures into your home is to invite spirits of deception. These objects silently call for worship that belongs only to the Almighty. The ancient warnings are clear. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. The presence of these idols in your life is a spiritual breach. Black candles and occult ritual objects, candlelight, may evoke warmth and peace. Yet black candles are often employed in occult rituals designed to summon darkness, to curse, or to bind another's will. These are not innocent implements of ambience. They are tools of spiritual warfare. To possess or use such items without discernment is to become a participant in a battle whose stakes are eternal. Ouija pendulums and spirit boards like the Ouija board, pendulums used for spirit communication, invite unseen forces. They claim to provide guidance, but open doors only to confusion and deceit. To trust these tools is to reject the guiding light of divine wisdom and surrender to whispers of falsehood and despair. Books on demonology or witchcraft knowledge is a double-edged sword. Books that teach the ways of witchcraft or demonology are not mere academic texts. They are invitations. To read these texts with curiosity is to tread a path lined with spiritual traps. The Holy Scriptures warn us, do not turn to mediums or necromancers, for they will lead you away from God. There is a profound reality that often escapes the casual observer. The world we inhabit is not merely physical, but deeply spiritual. Every object, every act, every choice carries a significance that transcends the material realm. Some things in this world are innocent, gifts from the divine order, while others are laden with spiritual danger, unseen but potent. It is a sobering truth that certain objects serve as conduits or doorways, through which forces contrary to the goodness and holiness of God can enter our lives. These are not merely superstitions or the stuff of folklore. They are real, spiritual dangers that have been acknowledged and warned against throughout religious history. The presence of these objects in one's life can invite curses, spiritual afflictions that touch the soul, corrupt the heart, and darken the mind. The power they carry is not an accident, but the result of their connection to occult practices, demonic influence, or idolatrous worship. To possess or even casually engage with such things is to expose oneself to spiritual harm, a harm that can be immediate and devastating. This is why it is critical to recognize the seriousness of the matter and not dismiss it lightly. The spiritual world operates on principles that are often invisible, but real and impactful. When an object has been consecrated or set apart for evil purposes, it becomes a vessel through which malevolent forces can act. The curse it carries is not simply bad luck or coincidence. It is a spiritual consequence, a binding that restricts the soul's freedom and invites hardship. The Holy Scriptures repeatedly caution believers against involvement with anything that might open the door to these dark forces, warning that such engagement leads to spiritual bondage and separation from divine blessing. It is not a matter of superstition, but of spiritual law. That which is associated with darkness will draw darkness near, and that which calls on the powers of evil becomes captive to them. The consequences are not always immediate or visible, but they manifest in broken relationships, loss, illness, confusion, and despair. Many are unaware that objects such as occult tools, cursed talismans, or idols carry with them this unseen spiritual danger. These items, often sought out in moments of curiosity, desperation, or rebellion, may seem harmless at first glance, yet they function as invitations to the spiritual realm, enabling forces opposed to the goodness of God to influence and torment those who possess them. In the religious tradition, these warnings are echoed as a solemn reminder that not all that glitters is good, and that spiritual vigilance is necessary to guard one's heart and soul. The ancient command to avoid mediums, necromancers, and idol worship is rooted in the awareness that these practices and their implements are gateways to spiritual harm. Engaging with such objects is not a neutral act, but one that can open the door to forces bent on destruction. This awareness calls for careful discernment and a posture of humility before the unseen spiritual realities. It is not fear, mongering, but a sober recognition that our world is intertwined with forces beyond human sight, forces that seek to ensnare the unwary. The spiritual warning is clear. To protect oneself and one's loved ones, it is essential to avoid these cursed objects altogether, to refuse the temptation to dabble in things forbidden by divine law, and to instead seek refuge in the light and protection offered through faith. This protection is not found in magical charms or talismans, but in a life anchored in holiness, prayer, and obedience to God's will. The warning is urgent and uncompromising, reminding all who listen that spiritual danger is real, that it is often hidden behind the ordinary, and that it demands serious attention lest it consume the soul. The question of moral responsibility in the face of spiritual danger is one that each person must confront with honesty and seriousness. It is not enough to simply acknowledge that certain objects or practices are dangerous. There is an inherent duty placed upon every individual to guard their soul and to make choices aligned with divine truth and righteousness. The freedom given to humanity by the Creator is profound, yet with that freedom comes accountability. Each person is responsible before God for the decisions they make, for the influences they allow into their lives, and for the spiritual paths they choose to follow. This responsibility is both a privilege and a solemn charge, for it means that the state of one's soul is not left to chance or external circumstance, but is shaped by conscious choice. To possess or use objects linked to occultism, witchcraft, or demonic forces is not a trivial matter but a willful act with spiritual consequences. The scriptures and religious traditions emphasize that individuals are called to holiness, to separate themselves from anything that would defile their spirit or lead them away from God's light. When a person knowingly embraces objects associated with darkness or invites contact with spiritual entities outside the protection of God, they are exercising their freedom in a way that opens them to bondage rather than liberty. This moral responsibility demands that one act not out of curiosity or rebellion, but with careful consideration of the eternal consequences. The soul is not a playground for experimentation, but a sacred trust given by God to be guarded and nurtured. There is also a communal dimension to this responsibility. Our choices affect not only ourselves, but those around us, our families, friends, and communities. When one engages with cursed or demonic objects, the spiritual repercussions can ripple outward, creating disturbances, divisions, or suffering that extend beyond the individual. Religious teachings often highlight the importance of stewardship, not only of the material world but of the spiritual environment in which we live. Each person's decisions contribute to the collective spiritual health or decay of their community. Thus, moral responsibility includes an awareness of how our actions influence the spiritual atmosphere for others. Choosing to reject harmful objects is an act of protection, not only for oneself, but for the loved ones and the community at large. Importantly, moral responsibility is also linked to the idea of freedom from sin and evil. True freedom is not found in unrestrained choice, but in living according to divine law, which protects the soul from destruction. This is why the religious tradition stresses the importance of repentance, confession, and turning away from harmful influences. To choose to rid oneself of objects that bring curses is an act of reclaiming that freedom, an assertion of allegiance to the good and holy over the corrupt and dark. It acknowledges that while temptation may come, the choice to resist and turn to God remains. The weight of moral responsibility is thus heavy but empowering. It recognizes that while evil seeks to ensnare, human beings are not powerless victims. Each individual has the capacity, and indeed the duty, to choose life, light, and holiness. This means exercising wisdom in what we accept into our homes and hearts, refusing what is harmful, and embracing what nurtures the spirit. It also means understanding that ignorance is not an excuse. The warnings have been given through sacred texts, teachings, and the witness of the faithful. To ignore them is to flirt with danger, but to heed them is to walk in the path of life. The call to moral responsibility is a call to vigilance, to intentional living, and to a profound respect for the spiritual realm that shapes all existence. In the midst of darkness and spiritual danger, there exists a power that is greater, a force that conquers all evil and breaks every chain, the power of the sacred. This power is not found in human strength or earthly riches, but in faith, prayer, and the presence of the divine. The sacred acts as a shield, a fortress, and a light that pierces through the deepest shadows. While certain objects may carry curses and invite evil, there are sacred objects and practices that carry the protective and healing power of God. These sacred elements serve as tangible reminders and conduits of divine grace, enabling believers to stand firm against spiritual attacks and to walk in freedom. They affirm that no darkness can ultimately prevail where God's light is present. Throughout religious history, sacred symbols, relics, and rites have been venerated as sources of spiritual protection. These are not mere superstitions or empty gestures, but profound realities that connect the faithful with divine power. The cross, for example, is not just a piece of wood, but a symbol of the ultimate victory over sin and death. Sacred water used in blessings carries the power of purification, washing away impurity and evil influences. Prayer itself is a mighty weapon, an act of communion with the divine that calls forth protection, guidance, and deliverance. Such sacred practices invite a presence that dispels darkness and establishes peace. The contrast between cursed objects and sacred objects is stark. While one binds the soul, the other liberates it. This power of the sacred is rooted in a relationship, a living connection between the believer and the divine. It is through this connection that spiritual fortitude arises. Those who embrace the sacred are not left defenseless in the face of evil. Instead, they are clothed in righteousness and surrounded by a spiritual hedge of protection. The sacred is not passive. It actively resists and rebukes the forces of darkness. The very presence of a sacred object or a faithful prayer has the power to disrupt curses and break spiritual chains. This power demonstrates that evil, while persistent and cunning, is ultimately subordinate to the holy and just will of God. The power of the sacred teaches an important lesson about the nature of spiritual warfare. It is not fought with worldly weapons or human cunning, but with faith, humility, and reverence. The sacred does not wield violence, but asserts a spiritual authority grounded in love and truth. This authority is a force of transformation, turning fear into courage, despair into hope, and bondage into freedom. Those who trust in this sacred power are assured that they need not fear the darkness, for the light that shines within them is stronger. The sacred thus becomes a source of inner peace and confidence, empowering believers to reject the curses that demonic objects might bring. Importantly, this sacred power calls for active participation. It is not enough to simply possess a sacred symbol. One must also live in accordance with the values and faith it represents. Holiness, prayer, and obedience to divine guidance are what activate and maintain this power. The sacred invites believers to continually align themselves with God's will, to walk in purity and truth, and to resist the temptations and enticements of evil. It is in this ongoing spiritual discipline that the protective power of the sacred is realized fully. Through this, the believer becomes a beacon of light in a dark world, demonstrating that no curse, no demonic object can hold sway where the sacred reigns supreme. Curiosity is often celebrated as a virtue, an insatiable desire to learn, explore, and uncover hidden truths. Yet, when it comes to the spiritual realm, curiosity can quickly become a dangerous trap. The yearning to experiment with forbidden objects or to dabble in occult practices may seem innocent or even exciting at first, but it often opens a door to forces far beyond human control or understanding. The danger lies not in curiosity itself, but in allowing that curiosity to lead one into realms that are forbidden by divine law and fraught with spiritual peril. This is why many religious teachings warn against the temptation to probe into the occult, to engage with objects known to carry curses, or to seek knowledge that is hidden for good reason. The spiritual world is not a playground for the curious mind, but a battlefield where every step must be taken with caution and reverence. The curiosity that drives a person toward demonic or cursed objects can be fueled by many motivations: fear, desperation, rebellion, or even a desire for power. Yet, regardless of the reason, the consequences remain the same. When one begins to seek out these objects, the risk of spiritual enslavement becomes real. Forces attached to these items do not respond to human commands, but act according to their own dark nature, binding the unwary into cycles of torment, confusion, and despair. The object itself, often underestimated or dismissed as harmless, becomes a doorway through which malevolent spirits exert influence. This is why the religious tradition counsels restraint and humility, emphasizing that there are limits to what humans are meant to uncover or manipulate. True wisdom lies not in reckless curiosity, but in reverent obedience to divine boundaries. Curiosity toward cursed or demonic objects reflects a deeper spiritual condition, a heart not fully aligned with God's will. It reveals a vulnerability, an opening through which temptation enters. The human soul, created to seek God and goodness, becomes vulnerable when it turns toward forbidden knowledge or power. The spiritual dangers of curiosity are compounded by the fact that these objects often carry with them invisible bonds, curses, or attachments that are difficult to break. A fleeting moment of curiosity can lead to long, lasting spiritual consequences as one finds themselves ensnared in patterns of fear, sickness, or misfortune that seem inexplicable. Many testimonies within religious communities speak of such experiences, cautioning others to avoid even the smallest engagement with cursed items. This danger is intensified by the modern world's easy access to information and objects of occult origin. In a culture where curiosity is constantly encouraged and where mystical or forbidden items are often marketed as harmless or even fashionable, the risk grows. The spiritual discernment required to navigate these temptations becomes harder to maintain. Yet, the call to spiritual vigilance remains urgent. The faithful are reminded that curiosity must be tempered with wisdom, and that some doors are meant to remain closed. Those who honor this teaching are spared the hidden dangers that curiosity can unleash. The danger of curiosity serves as a profound spiritual lesson. Not all knowledge is good knowledge, and not every desire to explore leads to freedom. In the spiritual realm, restraint and reverence protect the soul more effectively than unchecked inquisitiveness. This caution encourages a posture of humility before the divine mysteries, acknowledging that human understanding is limited and that some paths lead to destruction rather than enlightenment. By resisting the temptation to indulge curiosity about cursed objects, the believer preserves their spiritual integrity and maintains a clear path toward holiness and peace. Spiritual protection and deliverance stand as pillars of hope and restoration for those who find themselves entangled in the snares of cursed objects or dark influences. The reality of curses and spiritual bondage is not merely theoretical, but a lived experience for many who have encountered objects imbued with malevolent power. Yet, the story does not end in despair or defeat. There is a way back, a path to freedom that has been revealed through faith and divine mercy. The power to break curses and overcome demonic oppression is available, not through human strength or occult countermeasures, but through the grace and authority granted by the sacred. This protection is rooted in the belief that no evil can withstand the presence of God's light and love when invoked with genuine faith. Deliverance begins with recognition. The awareness that one is under spiritual attack or bound by a curse is the first step toward liberation. Many who suffer from the influence of cursed objects experience symptoms that cannot be explained by natural causes. Persistent fear, nightmares, a sense of oppression, or repeated misfortune. This recognition calls for a response grounded in spiritual authority. Prayer, confession, and renunciation of all ties to the cursed object are essential. The act of renouncing is not merely symbolic, but a powerful declaration that the individual rejects the darkness and calls on the protection of the divine. This spiritual posture aligns the believer with the forces of good and places them under the canopy of God's safeguarding presence. The process of deliverance also involves the intervention of spiritual leaders or ministers who carry the authority to pray for healing and protection. These prayers, rooted in Scripture and faith, are instruments through which the curse is broken and the individual is restored to spiritual health. The sacred rites of blessing, anointing, and laying on of hands are not mere rituals but channels of divine power that dismantle the work of evil. The effectiveness of deliverance is closely tied to the faith of the person seeking it and their willingness to turn away from what caused the curse in the first place. True deliverance demands a transformation of heart, a turning toward holiness, and a commitment to walk in obedience to divine guidance. Spiritual protection also calls for ongoing vigilance. After deliverance, the individual is encouraged to cultivate a lifestyle of prayer, regular participation in sacred practices, and continuous reliance on divine grace. This ongoing spiritual discipline acts as a shield against future attacks and helps maintain the freedom gained. It is a reminder that spiritual warfare is not a one-time event, but a continual journey. The believer who embraces this discipline is equipped to recognize and resist the subtle tactics of darkness before they can take root again. The community plays a vital role in spiritual protection. Fellowship with others who walk in faith provides encouragement, accountability, and support. Shared worship and collective prayer amplify the protective power available to the individual. The communal aspect underscores that spiritual freedom is not isolated but interconnected, woven into the fabric of a faith community standing together against evil. Spiritual protection and deliverance affirm the victory of light over darkness. They provide hope for those trapped by cursed objects and remind all believers that no matter the depth of spiritual bondage, freedom is possible through faith. This assurance inspires courage and perseverance, reinforcing that the power of God's protection is stronger than any curse or demonic influence. It calls each person to trust fully in this divine power, to seek deliverance with sincerity, and to live in the confidence of a soul reclaimed and restored.